Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I hope you're all well. Thank you for attending. My name is Nicole Smith. I'm the Director of Library and Archives at the York County History Center. This program is being recorded and will be available on the History Center's YouTube page. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat feature throughout the program, and we'll address them after each speaker. Just to start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why we're here today. 2 years ago, the History Center started the Share Your History project with Ophelia Chambliss, artist and community historian. The project's goal is to collect stories from diverse and underrepresented communities within York County for the History Center archives and museums. Last year, we offered community scanning days where people could bring in documents and photos to be scanned and archived. Now we want to develop a team of staff and volunteers to do oral history interviewing. It's recommended that this be done online right now, but hopefully we can offer in-person interviewing in the future. We also plan to offer a future training day next year to expand on the ideas and skills we talk about today. If you're interested in volunteering for the History Center, please contact me by phone or email. Oral history is a powerful tool to document community and family history. It also can be used to document the experiences affecting people's lives today. We are living in historic times. So we are excited to have with us today Barry Loveland and Dr. Monea Abdul-Majeed. Thank you both for being with us. Barry Loveland is the co-founder and chair of the LGBT Center of Central PA History Project. Barry was also chief of the Division of Architecture and Preservation for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. A new book has just come out titled Out in Central Pennsylvania, The History of an LGBTQ Community by William Burton and Barry Loveland. This was published in 2020 by Penn State University Press and is largely based on the History Project's collection of oral history recordings and archival documents. Dr. Monea Abdul-Majeed serves as Racial Justice Coordinator at the YWCA of York, where she is responsible for leading the organization and the York community to racial equality through training, community events, and involvement with York school districts, nonprofits, for-profits, boards, and faith communities. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology and politics from Washington and Lee University, and she earned her doctoral degree in sociology and political science with concentrations in social inequality and urban sociology from Howard University. Now I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Monea, who will speak about cross-cultural interviewing and tips for working with Black and Brown communities.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Barry. I'm so grateful to be here. We have been planning this since before COVID, so it's a great time for us to be having this conversation. And it also makes this conversation a bit more complicated, you know, as we think about COVID-19 and not really being able to be in person, and how COVID-19 has also disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities. Also, since March, you know, we've really been in racial revolutionary times. Our society is reckoning with the murderer of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And just this week, we found out that there was no justice there. So yet again, the Black community was feeling some of that pain and hurt. Ahmaud Arbery, and, you know, not to mention the Amy Coopers and this political climate that we're in right now. So, you know, we have to bring these things to light to have any conversation with Black and Brown people. Typically, we use the term BIPOC, which includes all, it's supposed to be Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so I always kind of laugh because in 2010, when I got my PhD, we didn't have all those terms. And the terms change over the years. But for right now, this is the term that we have found that includes everyone, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So during this time, a lot of Black, Indigenous people of color have told me they're tired, they're grieving, and they feel that they're being re-traumatized, angry. Some people are very hopeful, and some are experiencing every emotion in between, and it just kind of varies on a different day. And then I work with a lot of white allies who are saying that they are confused, they feel defensive, they feel guilty, sad. Some people are really hopeful because they are now becoming aware and they are able to see how they can be the change. But I think more and more we're being forced to talk about race. We're being forced to acknowledge race and racism across cultures. And so I was excited when Nicole and Barry brought this topic to me because I think it's very important. I spent 16 years at the US Census Bureau, and I was working on data, and I did a lot of different data analysis, and I did a lot while I was there. I didn't stay in the same office for 16 years, but I've had this wonderful opportunity to study qualitative and quantitative data, right? So number crunching and statistics and look at it, all these nice graphs. And then I've also had opportunities to administer focus groups, face-to-face interviews, cognitive interview testing. And so as this pertains to my racial equity work, I think that we need both. I think that we need the quantitative data, the numbers, the statistics, but we always used to say that statistics were human faces with the tears wiped off. And so that's where the qualitative data comes in, the stories that are so rich and so full of our real humanity and dignity. And so when I was given this opportunity to speak, that was the first thing that came to mind, that I've been talking about how storytelling can really eliminate racism. I believe this is a big part of the puzzle that is undervalued, and it needs to be used more in our work. And so I wanted to talk today about some of the tips for having those hard conversations and interviewing the BIPOC population. So keep in mind that I'm speaking to white interviewers, right? So if you are a white interviewer and you are looking to interview Black, Indigenous people of color, what are some of the things that you can do to make that experience better for you and for the narrator, the person that you're interviewing? So I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to give you some tips. And then I think Nicole has given me an opportunity to also answer some of your questions. So top tips for interviewing BIPOC communities. So there's 5, right? I tried to break them down into 5. Connection, context, consent, confront, and community. And so now I'm going to walk through those. So this first one is connection. So, I'm one of those people, I've done a lot of different things. So I mentioned my statistical background, my racial equity background, but I'm also a certified yoga teacher. I'm a 500-hour yoga teacher. And I understand that no matter what you're doing, connection is so important. So what are some of the ways that especially white interviewers can connect better with BIPOC communities? Know our names. Take time to learn how to pronounce them. Oftentimes, when people struggle with my name, I will create an audio and say my name and send that to them because our names hold so much of our history, so much of our family history. And in the context of the United States, when we were enslaved people, they would take away our names. So learning our names, being comfortable saying our names is very important for connection. Also, ask Black, Indigenous people of color how they'd like to be referred to. Oftentimes people say, are you Black? Are you African American? Are you Indigenous? And it depends on the person. the one thing that I often find in my work is that white people kind of have this monolithic view of us, like we're all the same, and we're not. So just have that humility to say, how would you like to be referred to? Because I get excited when people say, you know, I'm Black. That's my history and I love it. But it's almost like sometimes white people are afraid to say things like Black, Latinx when they describe us. And it just comes across as very awkward. So it doesn't help with connection. So just ask. Another part of connection is find something that we have in common, right? So sure, you know, I'm a Black woman, I do all these things, but I'm also a mother, I'm also a wife. I like to ride my bike. I'm a person. And I think that a lot of times what we've seen in the history of the United States is that Black, Indigenous people of color, we have been stripped from our deep humanity. And so interactions with us are sometimes people don't realize that we're people, right? We have things that we love, things that we enjoy. And so maybe try to find something in common with the person that you're interviewing. And also, this is a tip that I just added yesterday, because I was thinking about COVID-19 and how it's been difficult for me to connect because we're in a virtual platform. Difficult, but not impossible. So one way to deepen the connection is to think more about intimacy, right? So you can cover your background, right? You can have a screen where people can see, or you can invite that person to your home. So when you share your background, you're also increasing the connection. Because if you are an interviewer, maybe one of your kids is running behind you, maybe you have pictures, or just, it's a way of inviting the BIPOC person into your world as well, versus shielding yourself, right? And so I think that it's important for connection, especially in the virtual space. And when I talk about some of the other ones, when I talk about consent, because you can share your background, but you're not going to require that they share theirs if it's something that you're doing virtual, but I'll get to that. So that's it for connection. The next is context. Be aware of the context. You know, if you are hiding under a rock, only if you're hiding under a rock, you don't know what's going on in our world right now, right? But I would encourage you to be aware of what's going on, because oftentimes white people have the advantage of not having to deal with the context, not having to even think about Ahmaud Arbery and just kind of go on. But BIPOC population, we don't have that luxury. And it really does help if you enter the interview understanding the context. So that also means the context of race, the history of race in the United States, right? As well as slavery, as well as capitalism, as well as the exploitation of Black labor, you know, all these things. And now that we're thinking about exploitation of Black labor, it might even be a good idea to give the person you're interviewing some type of incentive because they are sharing their story. But to understand that context before you enter the conversation, because so much of systemic racism is compounded, it's happening over time, right? Also the history of York. I'm not from York, I've been here for 4 years, and I remember my first couple of trainings, the race riots kept coming up because there was such a spirit of loss and trauma among BIPOC populations around the race riots. So as the interviewer, know the context and also know the cultural norms. There are a lot of Black and brown people. If they like you, they will prepare a meal for you. And if you don't take a bite, they might get offended. So maybe there's a questionnaire that you ask beforehand about some of the cultural norms. Or, you know, if you're coming to their home, probably not possible now, but, you know, taking off shoes, I know that's a big cultural norm in my home. So just understanding the cultural norms of the person that you're interviewing. The next one is huge, consent, right? Consent, giving Black, Indigenous, people of color options, as many options as you can. Because so much of racism is about power hoarding versus power sharing. So what are some small ways that we can emphasize this power sharing, right? Give them the option. What time are you available for this interview? Where do you want to meet? How would you like to be interviewed? Phone, Zoom, just as many options to make that person feel more comfortable. What times are good for you, right? Oftentimes we take it for granted. Some people work all day and then you want to interview them at 6 or 7 at night, and that might not be the best time for them to share. They might be tired. So all of these things, to the extent possible, honoring and giving consent. Even saying, you know, it's my invitation, the vocabulary you use, you know, I invite you to do this versus like, do this, send this back, respond by this date. All of these things, changing the vocabulary welcomes more consent and more choice. The next one that is also a part of this whole consent thing and why this is important is because you really want to build trust. You want to build trust. And so another part of this power sharing is perspective taking. So when Black, Indigenous, people of color, when we're sharing our stories, you are listening to our stories as we share them, not as you would have it be in your mind. Because again, with this history of racism, there's this thing that has been done to Black, Indigenous, people of color, gaslighting, where we tell our stories, people, you know, may not believe that, you know, we've experienced certain things, or will try to convince us that we misinterpreted or we're being too sensitive, when in fact it is an act of racism. So you definitely want to exercise perspective taking. Be transparent with information, all information, in dealing with Black and brown communities. So, you know, with emails, like just being very clear about things, because the minute you omit some information, there's the trust factor all over again. And again, we have to think about the history of slavery and Jim Crow and why that has made it so hard for Black, Indigenous, people of color to trust white people. And I understand, you know, you are an interviewer, it's not your fault. I'm not blaming white people at all, but I am saying that it's a very good idea to be aware of the context, because there's a reason why there's such deeply rooted trust issues, and not just from the past, but even now, especially in the context of York, where this is a very small community and a lot of Black and brown people are afraid that if they say the wrong thing, if certain information gets out, they could lose their homes, they could lose their jobs, their children could be harmed, right? Because that's the environment that we're in. So this goes back to understanding the context. Also, be impeccable with your word. If you say you're going to do something, do it. If you cannot do it, say you can't. If you're unsure, say you're unsure. You'll do more research. Because again, you're building this trust, which is extremely important to the relationship that, you know, and really this is about an authentic relationship, because who would tell you their story unless they feel that they have a relationship with you? The next one is confront. Confront your own implicit racial bias. Now, I understand I'm using big terms, and Nicole said she only gave me a half hour today, but she promised that in the future, I might be able to come back for a longer period of time, because the implicit racial bias is a training all alone, you know, by itself, because here's the thing, we all have implicit racial bias. That means that we have stereotypes about Black people, about brown people, deep down inside. And sometimes they don't come out. They're on a subconscious level and they don't come out until you're actually interacting with a Black or brown person. So I would say, understand your own implicit racial biases, the stereotypes that you believe, the messages that you've gotten from your parents and your grandparents about Black and brown people, and really confront those, know exactly what those are, because even though you have them, they do not have to translate into actions and behaviors. So they don't have to affect the way that you treat Black and brown people. If you are aware of them and you are actively working to get rid of them, And so I think that's extremely important to know, to do your own self-work before going into this interview or this very sacred space. Our stories to us are very sacred. Even going back to African traditions, there's a principle of Sankofa that you can't focus on the future if you don't know where you've been. In African traditions, I was talking to Nicole and Barry yesterday about griots, where in West Africa, the younger people would sit at the foot of the elders to learn the stories. And so this is sacred space when we're talking about our stories. And so you want to do your own work before walking onto the sacred ground. And also, this is extremely important because a lot of Black and brown people have experienced microaggressions that come out in the way that white people communicate with us. And unless you are aware of microaggressions and your own implicit bias, you can commit a microaggression unknowingly. And so it's very important to do your own self-work, and that includes trainings, working with people like me, and there's a lot of other people who do this work to really help you understand areas that maybe you can grow in, as you have conversations with Black and brown people, and not just for interview or for the History Center project, but in life in general. It's very important. It's also important to know your own implicit racial biases, because when you're in these interviews, you do not want to center yourself. You are centering the needs of the Black, Indigenous person of color. And so what does this look like? This looks like a white interviewer going in, and a Latina woman is telling her story, and then all of a sudden the white interviewer just starts crying and tears flowing everywhere. And then the Latina woman has to then comfort the interviewer. But that is no longer centering her, the Latina woman. So before you go in, making sure that your needs, like you are very centered and you're very grounded, because we've often seen, if you just Google it, they call them like the white woman tears, where white women are in situations and they just start breaking down crying, and the whole room is now comforting them and focused on their needs, which is a big distraction from the Black, Indigenous person of color, who is really at the center of the interview, at the center of the storytelling. So you definitely want to be aware of that. It's something very common that I've seen in this work. And then the last one is that community is so important to Black, Indigenous people of color. I can't overstress this one. The way we gather, the way we communicate. And so I was really talking to Nicole yesterday about, instead of having this be a face-to-face interview, maybe making it more like a focus group where, the interviewer is observing a gathering. And I'm sorry that, we're in COVID, but our gathering, on churches, when I grew up in DC, sitting on the front porch, right? My grandmother would sit out and everybody would just come around and we would just talk. And that's where all the stories came out. Some of the stories come out in jokes. Some of the stories come out in nicknames. They'll call cousin so-and-so, he's cousin Speedy because he was speeding down the street and ran into a light. And, and there's all this history in the jokes, in the nicknames. And sometimes our stories get loud and we get excited. And I've noticed this interesting dynamic, because even when the story is like really hard and when you reflect on it, it's not the best thing. But our Black, Indigenous people of color, we find a way to laugh at that too, and to really bring hope and all these things. And it was only until I grew up that I was thinking about some of the stories, and I was like, that was a real act of racism. But when I heard it from my family, it's almost like a coping mechanism to make some of what we've experienced a lot less traumatic. So we use music, we use, like I said, jokes, we use songs, I even had some of the stories passed down. People made up songs about funny stories from our family history. But I think that all this is important, that, you know, really for us, building community and having focus groups with Black, Indigenous people of color is probably your best bet, because a one-on-one interview where I, you know, just me, I'm expected to tell a white interviewer all of my story, I might have some guards up. It might feel like a job interview. And the way that a lot of Black and brown people, we do job interviews is that we do this thing of code switching, where we speak a certain way and we have to appear to rise to the standards of white dominant culture. But that's not really who we are. Like, that's not where our soul is. And so for this interview, if you really want the stories, you're going to have us in our natural state where we feel free, where we feel that we can completely be who we are. And so if you want the real deal, the stories that are so rich and so powerful that we have to share. And so that kind of leads me to how you even choose the people that you interview. It might be a good idea to do a snowball effect. And this is just an interviewing technique where, you know, you interview a certain group and then you ask them, who else can we talk to? And then they pass you on to someone else. Who else can we talk to? Because what's also going to happen is if you do the snowball, the people that you just interviewed, if they trust you, they will say, oh, cousin so-and-so, oh yeah. You know, you can talk to Nicole, you can talk to Barry, they're okay. Because we're also communicating with each other to keep each other safe. So I will stop there. I will stop sharing my screen. And Nicole, did some questions come up?
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Monea,
You're
for
welcome.
your insights and participation today. I will be putting your contact email at the end of the program for any future questions. Right now, we have one question about implicit bias, and what would you say are some common examples of microaggression?
Mm-hmm. The most common is, oh, Dr. Monea, you're so articulate. You know, as if, you know, there is this, and underneath that is the message that if you are Black, that you're not supposed to be articulate or smart. Or another one is, where are you really from? And I'm like, DC, you know, because what is underneath that is that you are not a part of American culture. Like, you are exotic. You must be from somewhere else. You might not be a citizen. You're an outsider. And that's especially important in York, because if you're not from York, that's a hard pill to swallow as well, because I'm not from York and I've had to build a lot of trust in the York community. Another example of a microaggression could be about what type of food do you like? Fried chicken? Or do you, you know, things like that. And it's like, wait, like maybe I don't like fried chicken. And I think that, see, here's the thing about microaggressions. It's very complicated because sometimes microaggressions are not from ill intentions. You know, another one is like, can I touch your hair? And this happened to me a lot when I went to my first predominantly white university. And at first I was like, I'm not letting you touch my hair. Like, that is a boundary issue. You don't need to. But then over time, I started to see that some of the white people that went to my college had really never been around a Black person. And so they never touched my hair. So I allowed a few of them, you know, and now my daughters, they go through that because they have beautiful cornrows, they have beautiful beads, and some of the white children want to, because they find it intriguing. So the thing about microaggressions is that they're not always from a place of bad intent. But I also teach how to apologize when you commit a microaggression. And that goes into the difference between the intention versus the impact, right? So you're not going to apologize from the intention perspective of like, oh no, that's not what I meant. I'm a horrible person. I'm so sorry. You know, you're going to apologize from the impact perspective, which is I'm sorry that could have offended you. Thank you for making me aware of that. Not only will I refrain from saying that to you anymore, but I also will refrain from saying that to other Black, Indigenous people of color. If I do it again, please just let me know. I apologize, right? So there's a difference. And, I'm always teaching that some of this is not about bad intent. Some of it is about ignorance. And I do, especially in York County, there are some white people who have never been around Black people or Latinx people or Asian Americans or Indigenous people, and so because I know that, I'm just saying, look, learn how to apologize right away because you will make mistakes. This work is so messy. Nobody gets a pass on mistakes.
That's great. We do have a couple more questions.
Of course.
Here's one. As a white woman who cries easily, do you have tips for decentering possible tears?
Yeah, so you're definitely gonna have to do your work before. And in terms of, the mindfulness piece, deep breaths, because that calms the nervous system, takes the body out of fight or flight mode, taking a swallow, sipping some water, right? And I think just being aware of it, that I will, because I'm actually a very sensitive person as well. But I know I have worked really hard on not centering myself with tears in the context of other relationships. If a person comes to me and they're offended and I'm like, oh my God, it's not about me, it's about them. And so this is a skill that can be learned. And so I just say to continue to build that muscle, it's not about me. Take those deep breaths, or maybe there's some imagery in your head that you can use. But I think it takes practice. And I also think it's going to take, talking to more Black and brown people before you actually do the interview to just get more comfortable. Because here's the thing, if you're awkward in a conversation with us, we can sense it, we know that you're not completely comfortable talking to us. And so we're not going to be completely comfortable talking to you either. It's just that simple. I think that oftentimes white people think that we don't know, but we can feel that it's kind of awkward and that you're on the verge of tears. And and I think it's just going to be a matter of doing your own work and kind of building that muscle, and maybe even saying hey, maybe this year I can't do the interviews. It's too much for me, but I'm going to work on it for next year. Because I think it's really important to stay grounded. Another thing I do is I say for people to uncross their legs and place their feet on the surface beneath them. So that's what I'm doing right now, because with that, you're tapping into this feeling of groundedness and rootedness. So there's other things that we can do in the body to create that feeling of being grounded. But those are all really good tips to start with.
Great. Number of questions. If one is, if I was visiting a Black home here in York, is there a gift I should take with me?
Sure. So you might want to just ask about cultural norms before you go, and then honor something like that. For example, in my home, we celebrate Kwanzaa, and our neighbor, she was so sweet. She wanted to bring us a gift, and she brought us all this candy and all this stuff. And she's like, Happy Kwanzaa. And I was like, well, I just thanked her. And then I gave her a Kwanzaa gift because Kwanzaa gifts are supposed to be handmade. So you make them with your hands. So you can make a little bracelet, or I've made people collages or bake some. It just has to be from your hands, right? But she didn't know that. And so I think that it goes back to a cultural norm. And, and sometimes maybe a gift isn't even a good idea if you don't know that person well enough, because sometimes it just comes off as being inauthentic, I'm bringing you this gift so you can talk to me. But if it's, but if you're interviewing a woman who just had a baby and you want to bring a baby gift, I think that's pretty natural. But to just, bring a gift to somehow say, hey, I'm not racist, here's a gift, I think that's a little awkward.
Okay, one question was, is there a respectful way to invite people to call me out on any microaggressions I might make without putting the burden on them?
Sure. So I think that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because I forgot to mention it. When it pertains to building trust, to be vulnerable. Hey, you know where this is all new to me. I really want to grow in this way. So if I say something, you're free to get connection, or if you feel like I think it's just a matter of it out there because we sense it already. So it's just a matter of like a humble.
Having some technical difficulties. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think we're back now. Let's see. Another question is, do you have any recommended reading on how to recognize and confront implicit bias?
Recommended reading on implicit bias. I don't know. I'd say Google it because there's a lot out there. I know that Harvard, they've done a lot of work on implicit bias in terms of, so go to their website because they even have an implicit bias test. But I think, oh, you know what? Actually, I forgot about this one. I hope it's right here, but it's called Me and White Supremacy. And what it is a, here it is, 1 second. It's called Me and White Supremacy. It's a 28-day journey, and it asks a lot of different questions about implicit bias. And it's very introspective. So each week, for 28 days, each day, you will look at a specific thing and how maybe you've done that. You know, and this is for white people. So like day 4 is you and white silence. What is white silence? When you're silent and you don't speak up, and how does it, and it'll tell you like, how does that show up? It'll walk you through, and then it'll give you some questions to reflect on. And from my work, I appreciate the introspective work, you know, in conjunction with systemic changes, with policies and procedures. But I do believe that doing that internal work is really good. So Me and White Supremacy. And yeah, I think those are really good places to start with that.
Great. And one final question about interviewing. This is, how do you interrupt to ask a clarifying question or kindly steer an interview without taking control?
I just wouldn't do that. I just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't interrupt. I wouldn't ask a question in the middle. I would just let that person be and let them continue to speak. Because who knows, if you don't interrupt, maybe they'll say whatever you need to know if you let that story emerge. I don't even think a lot of probing. And that's why I believe that the focus groups would be better, because it's like allowing people to share and you're an observer. Because the issue with interrupting and steering, again, that's about power hoarding versus power sharing. Because if you're steering, you're trying to control that narrative, and that's not up to you to do. So you want to let it emerge as it does. So I would caution against probing and steering a conversation a different way. Unless, you know, and maybe at the end, if you have any questions, it could be something like, tell me more.
Yeah.
Or I invite you to tell me more, you know, something like that versus like, yeah, because that could easily fall into gaslighting as well. So.
Great. They said that was a helpful answer. Thank you. That's
You're welcome.
Questions we have right now. Again, if you have any other questions for Dr. Monea, I'll have her email up at the end of the program. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess, Barry, it's your turn, right?
Yes. Thanks a lot, Dr. Monea. All right. I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I have. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for your interest in this program, and thank you for having me. I want to talk a little bit about the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project to give you some background on what I've been doing and with that project. And then also we'll be talking about sort of an introduction to what oral history is all about, why it's important, why oral history is important, especially in underrepresented communities. And then we'll talk some about principles and standards in oral history. And these come from the Oral History Association, which is the national organization of people who are in the practice of oral history. And we'll talk about ethical practices. And Dr. Monea was touching on some of those issues in her talk as well. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion at the end of this part of the program. And then we'll also talk about next steps. And that's going to be a conversation about, what we want to do as a community in York County to take this program further. So the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania started a history project in August of 2012. I worked with a couple of other people to get the project started. And actually we started our program with a story circle, much the way Dr. Monea was talking about, gathering a group of people to reminisce and talk about stories of the past. That was a program that we decided to have for the older group at the LGBT Center called Aging with Pride. And that was such a popular program that we decided that we really needed to not only present a program like this, but also have a way to capture those stories and to capture the documents and artifacts that tell part of the history of our community. So we formulated the idea of about having a history project. We've now conducted oral histories with 150 people in the community, the LGBTQ community in Central Pennsylvania. And we collected more than 100 linear feet of archival documents and artifacts. So it's a collection that is large and growing. And we continue to interview, and we continue to collect materials like this. And some of the photographs that I'm sharing with you in the program and the PowerPoint are items that we've accumulated in the collection. So I just wanted to give you kind of a taste of what we have been able to discover and collect. So our mission is to engage people in discovering, documenting, collecting, preserving, and presenting the stories of LGBTQ+ history in Central Pennsylvania through oral histories and material culture. So the presenting part of our history is just as important as the collecting part. And so we've been able to do oral history videos with people. So we've been able to put many of those oral history videos online on our YouTube channel. We also do text transcriptions of all the interviews, and those are online as well. We also have been doing a number of exhibits with materials that were collected and the oral histories. So these exhibits have ranged from small pop-up exhibits to much more elaborate exhibits. We've done collaborative art and history exhibits with art museums and historical organizations. And those have involved things like getting inspiration, having artists get inspiration from a piece in our collection or an oral history in our collection, and then doing an art piece based on that inspiration. And we've also done exhibits where we've documented the history of an artist's work over the course of time. So people who've had a long career in the arts, including a costume designer, a visual artist, as well as a performance artist. And so with digital, we're also getting into digital exhibits and digital archives. So we're trying to get as much of our collection up on the web as possible. We also have been doing traveling exhibits. We've done a couple of those now. One that toured across the state last year and traveled to 50 different venues around the state. And one that we just opened actually this past month, or this month in Harrisburg. And that one will be traveling again through next year once it's not, we have opportunities to do that again with the COVID-19 situation. We've also done publications, including our book that's just come out in Central Pennsylvania. And also programs where we've done things like story circles or lectures or other showing of films and things like that. So I'm going from the perspective more as an LGBTQ person. So some of this translates over into the other BIPOC communities, but I'm making most of my points from my perspective and experience. So I just wanted to say that from the LGBTQ plus experience, history has been, art history has been ignored, destroyed, and not valued. So many mainstream museums and archives have either ignored this history or been unaware of this history, or in many cases avoided the history because it's being considered too controversial for them to tackle. So it's important that we do this kind of work, that we collect this kind of material and collect these stories because it has been, just not been done in the past. LGBTQ plus people have not, in some cases, kept documents and artifacts out of fear of discovery or a lack of value of their own history. And so it's difficult sometimes to find this material. That's why it's so important that we reach out to the community as widely as possible and try to, get as much of this material collected as possible so that it's preserved for the future. In some cases, families who have come across this material in estates of someone who has passed away. The AIDS crisis brought this up extremely severely because of so many gay men especially, but LGBTQ people in general who were affected by the crisis, and many passed away, and the material that they collected over the years has been destroyed or disposed of by families thinking that this material is not important or that no one will be interested in it, or out of just shame and disinterest or embarrassment. And in the past, some governments and cultural institutions have actually destroyed evidence of LGBTQ life throughout the world. So it's important that we recognize the importance that this has to telling the full story of humanity. So again, why this is important is that no one else is telling the stories and history of the LGBT community in Central Pennsylvania. This is starting to change, and I applaud York County History Center for being one of the few institutions who actually are reaching out to try to make changes in that situation so that they're incorporating the stories and history of the LGBTQ community and all communities in the York County region. LGBT people in this region should learn about their history because it's the foundation on which their future is built. We often say that, unless we learn about history, we're destined to repeat it. And so we want to make sure that we understand how this community has evolved over time, and the aspects of trying to obtain civil rights protections. And we know now, just in the current situation that we're living in, the current political situation, that it's become again more difficult for this community. And we have to be aware of our history and how that work has been done in the past. The history should be available also to the general population to promote greater understanding and respect for LGBTQ people. So now I want to talk a little bit more generally about what oral history is all about. For those of you who are not too familiar with oral history, it's defined really as both the interview process and the product of a recorded spoken interview. So an oral history can focus on an individual's life story, or it can focus on a particular topic or subject of which you're trying to study. So it's important to tailor your particular project to whatever it is you're looking for as a researcher or as a general collector of this material. And in this case, I think in pretty much all cases, we're going to be looking for someone's life story. So oral history is done as a collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the narrator. And the narrator is the person who is telling their story. It's the person being interviewed. That's what we call that individual. So it's important, as Dr. Monea talked about, that you really build an understanding and a sense that you are working together to create the story and this recording. And that the person who is the narrator is really in charge of that. It's their story, and you are really the facilitator there to enable that person to bring that story out and get it recorded. The intent is to create a permanent record that contributes to an understanding of the past. And it's also preserved and made available to researchers and the public based on the consent of the narrator. So the narrator does have the ability to restrict any kind of access to their story and their information, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So why is oral history important? Well, it places the narrator's experience within a larger social and historical context. It enables us to find the particular perspective that someone had on a series of events or a course of period of time that they lived. It captures recollections about the past that are filtered through the narrator's view and memory. That's important to realize because not everybody is going to have the same perspective on a particular context of time or events. Their experience is going to be different from other people, and their memory is going to be different from other people. They may not remember exactly the same things that happened that other people might remember. But they can also help fill in detail that's unrecorded anywhere else. And this is where I think it's extremely important that we have written history, which records a very small portion of information about the history that actually happened. And people's memories can help fill in a lot of detail that we don't have in those written documents. So why is oral history important for LGBTQ plus history? Well, schools typically don't teach this history. So young people growing up who come out and realize that they are part of the LGBTQ plus community, have nowhere to go really to find the history of their own community. Um, it's difficult to find local LGBTQ history in many cases. You can go on the internet and find some information about more globally, more nationally, the history of the community, but you don't have a place to find a lot of local information. So there's also limited written and photo documentation for this history. In many cases, the LGBTQ community shunned a lot of photography when they were in events or in programs and things like that, because in many cases, especially from earlier generations, they were not completely out of the closet. And so they were afraid to be photographed or afraid to have their names published in any kind of publication. So there's very limited information out there about who was involved and what they did and so forth. And this is particularly the case with earlier generations, that there were a limited number of out gay activists. In many cases, it was in smaller cities and towns, to have one person willing to print their name in the newspaper as being, a spokesperson for the LGBTQ community. That would be about all you could find. And it's difficult to go back and try to find who were involved in those early activist roles in the community and leadership in the community and so forth. So it really is difficult to sometimes discover what that history is and who was involved. There also is limited intergenerational interaction in the LGBTQ community. In many cases, young people coming out, the last thing they want to do is go talk to an old gay person. It's just not something that's on their radar screen as being important to them. They're excited about being out and meeting people their own age. So you don't find a lot of connections that are made between older LGBTQ people and younger people coming out. So there's no transfer of information in the community of stories and history and all that. And in people's own families, it'd be very rare that grandma or grandpa were LGBTQ or had much knowledge of the LGBTQ plus community. So you're not going to get stories within families intergenerationally of handing down the history of the LGBTQ community. And then there's a wide range of experiences in a highly diverse community. LGBTQ plus people span all races and all backgrounds and all walks of life. So there's going to be a wide range of experiences in that community in terms of their history and their knowledge and their background. So it's important to find as many from all those different walks of life and all those different communities to talk to and interview. And then there's limited shared knowledge and communication. Like I said, there's just a limited amount of history that is shared and understood between people within the community. And so why is it important for other underrepresented communities? I think in some cases it's similar, and in other ways it's different from the LGBTQ community. School curricula and textbooks really don't adequately teach this history. That may be starting to change now, but in many cases, the curriculum of high schools and other secondary schools have not really kept up with, teaching a wide range of history from all populations in the country. There's also limited written and photo documentation, I think, in other underrepresented communities as well. Participants in modern era civil rights movements are of advanced age now. So we're losing many of those. It's just recent, we've lost, several of these people that are important to the history of the modern civil rights movement. So it's important that we capture these stories and this history while we can. And many stories and memories are just not recorded anywhere. So it's important that we provide an opportunity for these stories to be recorded, preserved, and presented to the community. So I want to talk a little bit about the principles and standards that oral historians practice in this work. And the first and foremost is to have respect for the narrators and the communities from which they come. Dr. Monea talked a lot about this as well, and I think it's important that we approach the work from the standpoint out of respect and caring and empathy and just having a good connection with the person that you're interviewing as a narrator. The interview process must be transparent and with full informed consent of the narrator, and be sensitive to the differences in power between interviewer and narrator that often come up. And you want to try to eliminate those differences. Preservation of the interviews and related materials. It's important that with permission of the narrator, that they be available to researchers and the public. The narrator has the full, the narrator's in the driver's seat, if you will, in terms of what they want to share in the interview and the story that they created. And it's important to use ethical practices in all of your work, and we'll talk about ethics next. So you want to make sure that you start out by ensuring informed consent prior to the interview. And what does that mean? Well, we have a consent form that we prepared for our project, and we always send a copy of that to the narrator in advance so they can look it over and be sure they understand what is involved in the process. And it's also on our website so that it makes it available to anybody who wants to see it. So that person will have looked at this document beforehand, so they're in a better position to understand what their informed consent gives. And you want to inform narrators about the nature and purpose of the interview and project goals. So you want to talk a little bit about overall what the project is involved in doing and what their goals are, how they intend to use the interview in the future, and basically that the intent is to collect and preserve this history in York County and make it available to the public. You want to ask for consent and any restrictions on use after the interview is completed so that they know what they've said and they can think about that and then give informed consent at that point as to that the entire interview is fine as it is, or if they want to restrict any parts of the interview, or if they want to restrict the entire interview in some way. So they have, again, the opportunity to make any of those restrictions that they want on their interview. And it's important that interviewers have done preliminary research prior to the interview and are prepared to ask informed historical questions. And also that they're familiar with the recording technology that they're using. So it's important that interviewers take the time in advance to find out a little bit about the person they're going to be interviewing, call that person, talk to them, get a good rapport and a sense of what their story is going to entail, and then they can be ready to ask questions that are pertinent to that story. So we also, in the ethical practice, we talk about collaboration, and we try to obtain diversity in narrators to get a variety of points of view. That's important with all underrepresented communities. Also to strive to minimize that power differential and any biases or areas of disagreement between the interviewer and the narrator. You want to lay that all aside, and you want to focus on the person you are interviewing, the narrator, and make sure that that person really is in control of the story and the interview. You want to strive to minimize potential harm to the narrator. You want to work on being careful about your language and your approach to questions. You want to communicate to the narrator the right to refuse any answer any question. So again, they are in the driver's seat. If they have a question that you pose that is uncomfortable for them, or they just don't want to talk about that particular issue, they need to know that in advance of the interview that they can refuse to answer any question that you pose. Also, the opportunity to review the interview afterwards and provide final consent and authorization for use. If they want to take more time to read the transcript or to review the whole interview before they make that informed consent and sign the consent agreement, then that's their option. So the narrator can request to review the final product, as I just mentioned. They have the ability to restrict their access to that interview, redact any portions of it, add clarifications or corrections. If they've gotten the fact wrong that they realize later, they can make those corrections and changes. And so then there's a process of finalizing, archiving, and releasing the interview. And you want to promote equitable access to that information. If they've given you, the narrator's given you free and clear ability to publish that interview or provide access to that interview to anyone, you want to make sure that you promote equitable access. And that means that you don't restrict it to certain researchers who are doing work on a project or a paper. It's really open to anyone who wants to see that. Also provide the metadata, description and categorization of the interview, so that when you put it online, it has some context and some information available to understand what that information or what that interview is about. And you respect and you follow the narrator's directives at all times. So if there are restrictions on the interview, you need to make sure that that is placed with the interview, so that all people who are looking at that from an archival staff standpoint know that that interview can only be used in certain ways or at certain times, or however it is restricted by the narrator. So in the course of using oral histories, we want to make sure that we remain true to the words and the meanings of the narrator. So it's important that you go back and you try to understand and look in context. Sometimes transcriptions don't offer the best way to understand the meanings and nuances unless you go back to the video or recording, it's sometimes difficult because emphasis can be placed on different words that make things mean different things. So you have to be careful about things like that. Also, you want to properly cite evidence that runs contrary to that of what the narrator is talking about. There may be something about a date that they were called in the interview that was not quite correct according to the historical record of other sources. So you want to cite those other sources when you're talking about that particular event in the context of this interview. You also want to obtain written permission to use oral histories in various ways. And again, on our consent form, we tried to think of a myriad of different ways that we might use these interviews for in the future, including on the internet, including in documentaries or in exhibits or in programs and lectures and any other way that we could imagine that we might present this information to the public. You also want to record their permission on the actual interview itself. So we always ask them at the beginning of the interview, may we have your permission to record this interview, and then have them acknowledge yes for that before we start recording. Then also you want to plan for all potential uses for an oral history. So as I mentioned, that there are many different ways that you may want to use it in the future. So you wanted to include that as part of your discussion or as part of your consent form. That's my program for just an overview and introduction to the oral history process. There's a lot more that we're going to cover for those of you who want to, in the future, get a further training in oral history. There's quite a bit more that we'll be covering under a longer training program, probably in the spring or summer of next year. So anyway, I want to turn it back over to Nicole and see if we have any questions or discussion items.
Thanks, Barry. One question that came in is about someone that feels torn about preserving documents and stories that are critical of LGBT people. They're a trans person that wants to honor other opinions, but doesn't want to ignore and inadvertently make the past look more accepting than it was. So how do you feel about preserving things that are critical of LGBT people?
Well, it's a good question. It's actually not a question that we've had come up yet, because we haven't had any documents or materials donated to us that are what I would say critical. We have had some that have been within the context of a period of time are looked at as kind of anachronistic at this point, especially dealing with the trans communities. Language changes, as Dr. Monea mentions, in a lot of these communities, and the language has changed quite drastically in the trans community. And so having publications and other materials that use this other language can be sometimes offensive to people today. And so we have made the decision to preserve that information just because it is part of the evolution of that community and the thought about that community, including how they describe themselves in the past. So it's important to document, I think, that and put it in the context of today and understanding how, our language and our perspective on this community has changed quite a bit.
Dr. Monea, did you want to add anything to that? No? Okay. Well, I agree that that history history can be offensive and uncomfortable, but in order to understand, you have to preserve it all.
One thing I'll mention too is just as an example of that. We're looking to talk about the ordnance fight in Lancaster as part of an exhibit that a traveling exhibit that we did last year. And part of that was documenting the negative opposition to that ordinance. And as part of that opposition, there was a demonstration by the Ku Klux Klan in Lancaster, which we found photographs of the event, and we included a couple of photographs from that event, both the Klan's march as well as the opposition demonstration against the Klan, to show that this work that we are doing is not easy and faced a lot of opposition in the past and still can face a lot of opposition today.
That's a good point. We have one other question. It's more of a technical question. If someone wants to later change or add something to an oral history, how do you do that? Do you redo the entire interview, a part of an interview? Do you change it in the transcript? How do you recommend altering or adding?
Right. Well, I think that requires a conversation with the narrator. But I think what we would recommend is doing a supplemental interview that would help correct whatever needs to be corrected in the original interview, or if it's additional information that they wanted to present, that sort of thing. And then that both interviews would then stand together. If they decide that they really want to scrap the first interview and redo the interview, that's we're willing to do that. But it's what we find is that every time that you do an oral history interview, we've done, for example, with some people, as many as 3 different interviews. And we get new information all the time. And in some cases, we lose information if we were to scrap an earlier interview that is still valuable information, and it's information that the person wanted to share and was intentional that they would share it. So, by scrapping an earlier interview, sometimes you lose a lot more than you realize.
That makes sense. Well, I don't have any more questions right now. I promised some contact info, so I'm going to put that up.
We want to also talk about next steps.
Sure.
So let me just go back to my screen here. So what we're going to be looking for, I guess, from people who attended this session is, first of all, do you know people who should be interviewed from any of these communities? We're going to be creating a waiting list of narrators, and I think, Nicole, you'll be reaching out probably to, in many ways, through your networks, to all these communities that you are interested in interviewing, and asking for people who are interested in being narrators. We want to create this waiting list of narrators before we do a scheduled full training, because what I've found in the past is, unless you have some people willing to go, and willing to be interviewed right away, having any kind of time lag between the training and actually starting interviewing, it's more likely that the person who's been trained will feel that they no longer have a good understanding of what they're doing, and may be reluctant to do it. So we want to make sure that they can get right out and start working. We want to know if you've decided that you want to commit to being a volunteer interviewer. So you'd want to email Nicole and let her know that you know, are interested and you would like to sign up for the full training once it is available. And we'll be offering that training again sometime next year, we hope. Someday we hope that this situation with the COVID-19 virus will get more resolved and we'll have opportunities to get together in larger groups. And that will be pretty much a full day of training, probably around 5 or 6 hours altogether. And then also we just want to encourage you to spread the word about this this project. Nicole, I'll let you.
Yeah, that's great. And any questions for the presenters or about doing interviewing, please just email or call me. And thank you both so very much. This has been very educational for me today. So
thank you very much.
and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nicole. Thanks, Barry.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.